Hey guys, it's Ajax from Team High Society, and today I'm going to start the build video for the Atmospheric Adventures Atlas 180, and this is going to be a multi-part series on basically how you go from frame to a quad ready to fly. So this will be the first part, which is going to be basically the power systems, so motors, ESCs, and power distribution board. So let's get started. First thing we got here is the frame, and obviously you want to choose your motors based on the size of the frame and what you want to do with it. This being a 180 size quad, I'm going to go with some 1806 motors, and I've chosen these Dragonfly 1806 2300 kV platinum motors. They were cheap and have got pretty good thrust numbers. We're going to use little B 20 amp ESCs, which should provide, with the thrust bench we got a maximum of like 18 amps out of these things, and they were getting pretty hot, so this 20 amp ESC will handle anything the motor can. So basically, what I like to do is kind of mentally figure out what we're going to do here. So, obviously the motor's going to mount there. I'm going to mount the ESC on the arm on the top so that there's airflow over it to cool it down. And then obviously right here in the center is where the power distribution board is going to go. And then on top of that, the flight controller. So these are clearly going to be long enough. So that's basically the layout that we're looking at, is to put the motors on the end with the wires facing along the arm, and then we're going to put the ESCs on the frame, kind of like that, on top, so that when the prop spins, there's air flowing over these things. So the first order of business here is to get these things mounted, and these motors take M2 hardware, which is metric 2 hardware. I've got some here, so I'm going to go ahead and start mounting these things. So here we go. I guess I should mention this now. With these slotted holes in the arms, which allow for multiple size or different size motors, you want to make sure that you get the motor centered on there. So on the bottom of the motor, there's like a little C-clip, and you can see the bearing, and you want to make sure that that C-clip and that bearing are centered right on the hole in there. Like I said, since these are meant for multiple size motors, the slots can slide around a little bit. So you just want to make sure that you put in all 4 of the bolts, and it'll line it up in the center. Okay, so I've got all the motors mounted up here, and like I said, I'm only using 2 screws each at the moment. So the next thing to do is to mount the ESCs on the arms. And if you're a beginner, you'll notice that there's 3 wires on all of these motors, because these are brushless AC motors. So to change direction, well, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. We're using ESCs that can be programmed, so we don't have to worry about the direction of the motors right now. That's why we're just going to put them on, and we're just going to solder the motors directly to the ESCs. However, there's 3 wires coming out of the motors, and there is no particular order in which they need to be soldered to the 3 pads on the ESC, or to the 3 wires coming out of the ESC. If it doesn't spin the direction that you want, swap any 2 of the 3 wires and it'll change direction. Now again, these ESCs can be programmed through a flight controller, so directly with USB through Clean Flight. So I'll just change the direction of the motors, that the motors turn later. And since we don't have a lot of space on the arm, obviously we're going to put the ESC right there. You'll notice that there's really not a lot of space between the edge of the ESC and the motor. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut off the heat shrink from this ESC, and we're going to desolder these 3 wires and basically just tape the ESC to the arm in place, and then we will cut these to length and solder them directly to the ESC. So turn on the soldering iron here. I'm just going to cut the heat shrink off so I can get to all the terminals here. Careful not to stab yourself in the finger. Safety first. If you don't want to cut all of the heat shrink off of your ESCs, you can just cut it away on the side where you connect to your PDB, and the side the side here with the 3 leads that go to your motor. But the way I do it is I get these little pads of adhesive backed foam. Some people call it funky foam. It's, let's see, I think it's 16th inch thick foam, and it's just adhesive backed. It comes in sheets. You can get it from your local Michael's or Hobby Barn or whatever you call it. And what I do is I just put a little piece of adhesive down, and the foam kind of mashes flat against the components on the ESC so that it doesn't wear through. Carbon fiber is conductive, and if it wears through the heat shrink, or even we've just put like a piece of tape on there, the vibration will eventually wear through, and then some of the components, the surface mount components, can short out on the frame. So I like to use this little piece of funky foam, put it right on there, and then wrap the ESC, so wrap around the ESC and the arm with just some good quality electrical tape. I'm using the Super 33 Plus vinyl electric tape. It's good stuff. So let's get one of these done here real quick, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So you see I've cut the heat shrink off of the ESC, and now we're going to desolder these 3 wires here. See if I can do this one-handed. Or two-handed, rather. Left solder, using like that. Come off a little bit of solder on that. One. Help me out a little bit. Grab that second one. Jeez, man. Of course, this is not strictly necessary if you have enough space that you can actually solder these wires to the motor wires, but obviously we have tons of excess here and very little space. Okay. So I'm going to take a look here about the placement for this funky foam and the ESC. That looks about good. Gives me enough length on these motors that it's workable and doesn't put me too far into the frame. It's not in the way of any major components. So I'm just gonna mark the edge of the frame there. I'm gonna peel the adhesive backing off. Wouldn't you know it, I can't see that mark I made, but right there looks about good. Alright, and now just going to get a piece of electrical tape here. Just enough to go around once. I'm just going to tape the Esc onto that piece of foam by wrapping this piece of electrical tape around. Doesn't have to be nice and neat. I guarantee you'll be redoing this at the end. So now you can see I've got the Esc just taped on. It's being held onto that little piece of funky foam, and you can see the spacing between the motor leads and those three little pads. So now I'm going to go ahead and cut these three leads that come off the motor. We're going to cut them, tin the ends, and then solder them down to this Esc. So basically, I'm just laying the wires down flat and cutting them to length so they'll be the ends will be right at those pads. Okay, so I've got, I don't know if you can see that in the light, but I've got all three of the ends trimmed, and they're almost lined up at those three little solder pads. Now these motors, and most motors, have silicon wire that is easy to strip. So what I'm going to do is just use my fingernail and pull, and you'll see that it just strips the end right off. And that's good because we don't really have enough room to get tools in here. Okay, all three of the ends, pulled them off, and now we're going to tin them, which simply means we're going to put solder on the ends here. Okay, so now the ends have been tinned, and we're just going to apply or solder each of the wires to one of the three pads. And this is where it gets a little tricky. I use some pliers so that I can hold the wire in place as I'm trying to solder onto these little pads. Here we go. actually had a little bit of a problem that I wasn't expecting there. Since this frame and everything is so light, when I tried to pull the wire back to solder it, the whole frame started coming towards me here. So let's see if I can weight this thing down here. I know it looks crude, but we're just gonna put some weight on there so the frame doesn't go sliding around. Okay, and there we have it. 3 wires of the motor have been trimmed and soldered to the ESC. The ESC has just been taped down with 1 loop of tape over some of this 16th inch adhesive back funky foam. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing for the other 4. Okay guys, so as you can see, I've got all 4 of the motors mounted, all 4 of the ESCs mounted. They're just taped down temporarily. We'll redo the tape later when the whole thing's finished, but right now it's just holding everything in place. So the next part of the power system is going to be your power distribution board. And what I've decided to go with is something very, very simple. It's bulletproof and it just works. This is a Luminaire 4 power, the number 4 power. It is 36 by 36, so it's the exact same size as the standard Naze or SP Racing or the Lux or the X Racer. All of the flight controllers have the same footprint. So basically, what we're going to do is we're going to use nylon standoffs to mount this right here in the center. So what I'm going to do, so I've got the stainless steel hardware here. Poke it through the bottom, and we're just going to screw these nylon standoffs on. These holes were pre-drilled in this frame because, like I said, that 36 by 36 millimeter package is pretty standard. So basically what you can see, what I've done here is I've put the 4 bolts in the bottom and screwed the standoffs on top so that they're standing proud of the frame here. So the next part is to get this 4 power board, and right here it's designed to take a Pololu step down regulator, and I've got that in order and it can be soldered in later. So the thing to note about this PDB is that the battery is listed here. These pads are for the battery, so you want to make sure that faces to the rear. So on this frame, this is the front and this is the rear. So I'm just going to go ahead, and this should just fit right on these standoffs, and the tension will hold it on. So there we have it. And the next thing to do is we're just going to route these ESC power wires in whatever way makes sense. So I can route those, and they don't stick out from the frame, so that's a good thing. And basically we're going to do the same process. You're just going to kind of manually route it, hold it, trim the wires off, and then we're going to solder it onto these solder pads. And there's ESC 1, 2, 3, and 4. This PDB could be different, just based on what you've got. This, like I said, is about as simple as it gets. The Pololu voltage regulator step down basically takes the 4S and gives it a 12 volt output, which is right here, and I use that to power the VTX on the camera. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and cut one of these wires here and solder it on and show you how to do that. So I like to give it a little bit of extra length. You want to make sure these are tight like banjo wires. You want to make sure they're nice and there's a little bit of play in the wires for vibration, stuff like that. So I've just kind of laid them out where I want them. I think it's good, and now I'm just going to trim them. And now I have the negative and the positive cut to length. So once again, just use your fingernail and you can strip off just the tip of the wire here. And go ahead, twist it a little bit, the strands here, so they don't come apart, and then we're going to tin the ends. The next thing we need to do is these solder pads are just blank, and so we need to just get a big blob of solder and melt it on there on both of the pads. You want to get a nice little pillow on there. You should be able to see a little convex little bubble of solder on there, and that way it's got a nice big pool of it, and so when you melt the wire in there, it contacts the whole pad and you can get additional current flow that way. We're not really going to be that hurting for current on this, with these motors, but it's always just good to get the right amount of solder on there. So now that we've got those little pillows, we're just going to solder the ends of the ESCs right on there. And again, I'm just going to take a little bit of time here to just route the cables just a little bit, just push them down so they're out of the way. And basically all we're going to do is repeat the process for the remaining 3 ESCs. Basically do a little bit of routing, trim them, solder them up. So I'll be back when that's done. Alright, well I figured that since we're doing this power system here, I might as well show you how I put a Pololu 5-volt regulator into this little PDB here. Like I said, this may not be something that you have in your quad, but just so we keep this series rolling and so you can actually see how I solder it in, I'm going to do it for you here right now. So I'm going to turn on the soldering iron here, start getting it heated up, and here I've got one of the Pololu 5-volt regulators. And basically the way this works is it's this little tiny board and it's got 4 holes on it for these header pins. And you solder this on, and then this just goes right through the holes on the board and it fits on there like that. Well, if you do this kind of just the way they recommend it, it just kind of hangs out here in the air. And I know that with multi-rotors there's a lot of vibration, and so this thing will vibrate and could eventually crack. So what I do is I get a piece of VHB here and I just cut a little piece off. And this really isn't actually holding, we're not using this VHB to actually hold this to the PDB, but it just dampens the vibration, and that's what we're going for. So, peel this back. Stick it to the bottom of the regulator here and peel that off. And I'm just going to go ahead and stick it to the board. So now it's in there. It's being held on physically by that, but it also prevents it from hanging out in the air. So when I solder these, it'll be at that little angle there. It holds it onto that VHB. I'm just going to go ahead and solder this thing in. Okay, so that's the 4 pins in the top soldered, but we still need to solder the bottom 4 to the bottom of or to the actual PDB. So flip it over and you can see the 4 pins there. Just going to solder and trim those. So here we go. Okay, and really that's all there is to it. So those stick out pretty far. So I'm going to go ahead and trim those flat with a pair of diagonal cutters here. Okay, and that's all there is to it. So now we've got the PDB with the 5-volt regulator on there, and that will take care of the fact that none of these ESCs have what's called battery eliminator circuits, or BECs, on them. So I'm just going to go ahead and solder the rest of these on like I did this one, and that will conclude the power section of this tutorial. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next section.